Welcome to Regent Park TV. I'm Kedar. Today we bring you an important interview with Brad Evoy, Executive Director of the Disability Justice Network of Ontario and a member of the Alpu Micmac First Nation. Brad has dedicated his life to the fight for justice for marginalized communities, drawing from his experiences as a disabled person to lead governance and community organizing efforts across Ontario and Newfoundland. His lived experiences and commitment to advocacy have positioned him as a critical voice in the intersectional fight for disability justice. rptv reached out to Brad following his participation in a media conference at City Hall last week, where he addressed the impacts of the increased Toronto police budget on marginalized communities.
And the priority in this city, if we look at a budget as a set of political priorities, the priorities is advancing policing, criminalization, and violence on our communities, and not towards the things that actually allow us to be and be part of community, whether it's in our housing spaces, which, as everyone here has already well stated, is an incredible crisis in the city and a state of fundamental social underinvestment. Where is the money for building actually accessible housing in the city? In particular, since the city has built new accessibility standards for public housing that have just been implemented earlier this year.
In this interview, he shares his perspectives on systemic poverty caused by inadequate social assistance, programs like OW and ODSP, and the consequences of prioritizing police funding over social supports. This conversation also delves into the troubling intersections of Canada's medical assistance in dying, MAiD policies, and social inequities. He discusses the need to focus on addressing these root causes: poverty, inadequate housing, and lack of supports, rather than normalizing state-assisted deaths as a response to marginalization. Finally, Brad emphasizes the need for a collective effort in advocacy, encouraging grassroots organizations and communities to work together and push for systemic changes that ensures equity, accessibility, and meaningful support for individuals with disabilities. Let's dive into our full interview with Brad Evoy, where he sat down with rptv journalists Fred and Dimitri to share his insights.
My name is Brad Evoy. I'm a member of the Halabu Mi'kmaq Nation, and I'm the Executive Director of Disability Justice Network of Ontario. Our organization was founded in 2018 to work to build a world where disabled people are free to be. And for us, that means working on systems where we can hold the powerful to account, be that through our education system, housing, social assistance, home care, and attacking the intersecting parts of our system that uphold those kind of things, be it medical racism, environmental racism, or all of the related pieces of neoliberalism and government-imposed austerity that actively harm our communities. Over the last 30 years, from Mike Harris to Doug Ford, we've had a consistent position among every layer of the Ontario government, which is that of social murder. We are living in a system where our overall social structures are underfunded and left to rot. And in many ways, that the same system is in place for ODSP and OW. There hasn't been a consistent effort from any level of government to really meaningfully keep pace with where social assistance should have been prior to the Harris cuts in the 90s. And ultimately, even efforts as of 2018 to make minor increases to ODSP haven't really brought us back to where people need to be. You know, when we look at some information from the Wellesley Institute recently released, you know, while we talk a lot about measures of poverty, what they put forward was a measure of what it costs to thrive and be healthy for disabled folks in the city. And the amount of income one would need to make in Toronto for that to be possible is somewhere between $75,000 to $85,000 a year. And in Mississauga, that's closer to $100,000 a year. So I think when we compare that to $733 that folks receive a month if they're on OW, or even less if they are in an institution through the system of institutional allowances, you know, we see a huge, huge disparity in what folks can access versus what we need to thrive in this city as disabled people. The impacts, I think, on folks have been huge, as affordability is seen in the general population as a crisis. For folks who are on OW and ODSP, this has just been even more intensified. The costs of rents have been going out of control in this city. The cost of food is so much higher. The cost of transit is simply too high for so many of our communities. And so I think when we compare that to the value of social assistance, the gulf between survivability and thrivability eventually is too huge for our communities. It's frankly unacceptable in every way and in every level by this government. So right now, when we look at the Ontario Police budget, there's an expansion proposed of their budget of $56 million. That's going to push the Toronto Police Services budget to over $1 billion. And I think this does a few things to our communities. One, we have to remember that Toronto Police Services is a major cause of violence and death to disabled folks all across this city. The reality is that for racialized disabled folks, Indigenous disabled folks, Afro-Indigenous disabled folks, there has been so many instances where the Toronto Police Services has caused so great a harm to our communities and many, many deaths through their operations. And ultimately, the way that Toronto Police Services and their fake union, the Toronto Police Association, operates is they have a hold on so much of this city in terms of getting the funding that they request for more officers to cause more violence, when the reality is this $56 million is more than planned expansions to the TTC, is more than funding going to the entire Housing Secretariat in terms of increases this year, is more than Toronto public housing, and either in community housing or seniors housing is receiving this year in increases. And you know, when we look at this, we have to ask ourselves, what are the things that we could be spending this on instead? And I think that when it comes to things that we think about, you know, the possibility to actually have money put behind some regulatory changes that were really great this year that happened, which is accessibility standards for buildings that are owned by Toronto Community Housing and Toronto Seniors Housing. Like, those upgrades could be happening with this kind of money. Further expansion to the TTC in terms of its accessible services would be excellent, rather than the TTC cutting corners with the so-called family of services model that's going to move people as much as they can off of Wheel-Trans. And, you know, looking ahead even to really basic kinds of things, like ensuring that the City of Toronto meets the very weak and failed standards of the Accessibility with Ontarians with Disabilities Act would be huge. But instead, you know, it's another $56 million to a police force that frankly doesn't keep anyone safe. You know, I think the key demand from that press conference and from that coalition overall was ultimately, we need to stop these unfettered increases to the Toronto Police Service. Ultimately, there are so many possible community services and community agencies that could use this money in a better way that actually improves the root causes of safety and well-being in this city. But ultimately, even though we have a political environment where many councillors and the mayor have said, you know, we want to lower the costs of police, we want to focus on areas of community well-being or community supports or, you know, the TTC or housing or these pieces, the reality is that once again, we're faced with a budget that's being held hostage by the power of the Toronto Police Service and their fake union. Ultimately, we need to have these folks have the political will and the community pressure to make that will possible, to change that and to change this acceptance that when the Toronto Police Service, and this is happening in other cities as well, so police services across the province pressure cities to simply give them more and more money, that goes nowhere for working people and disabled people in this city and across the province. So I find it really interesting, I think, when we talk about, you know, medical assistance and dying. So many people, when they advocated for MAiD, argued that this was about choice and argued that this was about people having dignity. But the reality is that so much of what has happened in the years since the implementation of MAiD has shown this to be a lie. The reality is that people are choosing MAiD because housing is unstable, because they don't have adequate social supports, because there's underinvestment across all of our social systems. And ultimately, in many cases, and this is shown in both provincial reporting as well as in federal reporting, isolation. And ultimately, isolation is created and caused by all of these other social systems failing. And so I think, you know, when we talk about MAiD, it is one of the ways that the federal government and the provincial government is trying to relieve itself of any responsibility for building real and robust social structures for folks across the country, you know. There was a time in the early 90s and prior when the federal government played a really big role in funding co-ops and other forms of more socially oriented housing. When you know, groups were more able to look towards and build futures towards you know, a more robust social system. And there are ways we could do that now instead, but rather, MAiD is the culmination of this 30-year system of social murder. And I think that when we put it in that context, you know, we have to be mindful that so many folks are focused on this aspect of choice. But do disabled folks in this country really get a choice to live in accessible housing, to have the funds available to support medical needs and food in their cupboards? And the answer is no. And even with how housing is designed in this province and around the country, you know, folks may not even have housing that is accessible to them, let alone to family members and others, to engage them in full, robust social lives. So, you know, I think that that's one aspect of this. And then on the other hand, You know, when we look at things in Ontario specifically, with the increased powers to policing and potential towards forced treatment that other parts of the province and figures are pushing, both mayors and people associated with the provincial government. You know, we kind of see it as a vice that people are placed in. On one side, there's the threat of policing and forced treatment and other things that institutionalize folks and increase institutionalization and incarceration of our people. And on the other hand, there is the option of MAiD. And so it's either, the increasing vice seems to be that disabled people are either pushed towards institutionalization and incarceration or death. And frankly, those shouldn't be the options that we have before us as communities. We need to reinvest in our social systems. And ultimately, that ranges from housing to social assistance to things like transit. And all of that kind of comes together for me in how we should be looking at things instead of continuing to expand MAiD and make it more and more accessible, even as some folks in Quebec have argued, to young children. When it comes to Isabella, you know, I think that, I guess on one hand, I don't think Isabella would see her choice as tragic. I think that in many ways, Isabella disagreed with, say, DJNO and others about MAiD and things like that. I think that we may have had different political positions on that system. But what I will say is I think that Isabella's overall advocacy and the work that she's done is undeniable. I think that the movement towards justice on social assistance and increasing social assistance rates wouldn't be what it is without the contributions of Isabella, the push initially to double social assistance rates, and now the push to surpass that and to go beyond doubling the rates are very much, Isabella's legacy to the wider movement. And I think that when we think about that, you know, we also have to think about the fact that while I think we would have disagreed on some pieces of MAiD and things like that, that Isabella's life and legacy and now passing is in the context of so many folks within our community either seeking MAiD and passing away, or passing away recently due to other health issues and complications. And that ultimately, whether it's through MAiD or through these sorts of things, we're facing a fundamental crisis across our communities, that so many people in our community are not receiving the services that they should be. So many people in our community are not getting the supports they need. And the reality is that this is an intentional system from government to push us towards use of MAiD, push us towards institutionalization through places like group homes or long-term care homes or what have you, to separate us from our communities. Or ultimately, that people don't receive the kinds of medical care and broader care that they need. And I think that, you know, all of those pieces kind of come together in that we live in Ontario in a system where this province, all of the cities around it, and the federal government too, have made a decision. And that decision is not to value the lives of disabled people. And in particular, to not value the lives of racialized disabled people. And so I think that when we think about that, and when we think about how we want to challenge these systems and build on the legacy of organizers like Isabella, we have to think about all the different ways in which these pieces are not just individual issues. This is not just an issue about social assistance or housing or looking at transit or home care or food insecurity. All of these pieces fit together in the lives of disabled people in this province. And so, I think we need to start thinking about things in a wider, systemic way to fully fulfill the kinds of legacies our forebears in the movement have left us. I think there's lots of ways that folks can get involved in this fight. We are at a time where there is very likely going to be a provincial election and a federal election coming up. And I think the thing I want to leave people with, if anything else, is that while it's important, I'm sure folks have different parties that they care about or different politicians that they'd want to support or what have you, ultimately, what matters most is that no matter who is in power today, tomorrow, or the next day, we need to pressure all of them. We need to keep the pressure up, and we can't stop. If that means that you as a grassroots group, organize in terms of direct action, if that means you engage in a rally, if that means you engage on social media, if that means if you write letters, if that means if you have meetings with other groups and network and build support structures in community, all of those things are important. And there's always a different way for folks to get involved in ways that they're comfortable. But no matter what we do together, we have to keep up the pressure. And we have to do it no matter if it's Doug Ford or Merritt Stiles or Bonnie Crombie or whomever. Because in the end, we've had 30 years of different politicians in Queen's Park and in City Hall. And in 30 years, not one has actually shifted the dial in terms of the overall system we're facing here. The constant underinvestment in social assistance, the inability to head off the many, many crises around housing, the complete failure to reinvest in systems like transit in a long-term kind of way. All of that comes together. And I think that instead of thinking about it from the perspective of, we want to see this big electoral change or what have you, it's that, no matter who's been in power over the last 40 years, every one of them have failed us. And so we need to build our movement and keep that pressure up no matter what. Something that we talk about a lot, which is that, when we think about social assistance in particular, we talk a lot about ODSP and OW, which is really important. But I think we also have to talk about other aspects of that as well that are kind of interrelated. And one of them that we've talked about a lot is institutional allowances, which are the allowances received by folks who are in group homes, who are in some long-term care sorts of settings. And, $7.33 a month for Ontario Works is really incredibly low, but institutional allowances in this province are even lower. Some as low as like $100 a month or lower. And so I think that folks, being able to include that in this conversation is really important to us in how we conceive these kind of pieces. And the other piece too, when it comes to the overall kind of well-being of disabled folks in this province, is that we also have to talk about disabled prisoners. And for us, we know from some of our work around supporting folks in Maplehurst and other provincial institutions that folks, number one, have been faced with a lot of broader abuses, human rights violations, and violence from within that system, but also, have a lot of restrictions in terms of the supports they can receive, even payment for labor done in prisons, which is so incredibly low in Ontario. And so I think, again, a lot of these systems fit together. For us, when we talk about, group homes and home care and those kind of pieces, that fits really well to us when we talk about prisons also, and when we talk about broader systems around education and how those pieces play out for disabled students. And so, you know, I would always just want to remind folks as much as I can that, you know, these are all interconnected systems. And it has been, again, a 30-year system of underinvestment across Ontario. And so, you know, I hope that we can come together and push back.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on social media, and for more information, check out our website.